Welcome back to History for Sleep, where we drift through the deep past one story at a time. Tonight, we're going on a slow, soothing journey into one of the most profound mysteries written in our very DNA. A time when the entire human story, every person who has ever lived or ever will live, hung by the thinnest of threads. Imagine, if you will, that every single human being alive today, all 8 billion of us, can trace our lineage back to a group of ancestors so small they could have gathered in a single valley. This is the story of how 900,000 years ago, 99% of our ancient human ancestors simply vanished, and how the remaining 1% against all odds became us. As always, I hope this video helps you drift off gently, or at least helps you put your worries into perspective by zooming out a few 100,000 years. Of course, there's a small risk that it might be too interesting and keep you awake. But if that happens, well, at least you'll have learned something fascinating along the way. Before we float off into the past together, I'd love it if you gave this video a like and maybe even subscribed if you haven't already. It really helps this sleepy little channel grow. I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. It's always such a joy to see our sleepy history community scattered gently across the globe. Now settle in, get comfortable. You don't need to remember any of this. You don't need to take notes or stay alert. Just let the words wash over you like whispers on the wind. And as we begin this gentle voyage into the vast unknown, remember this video is for educational and relaxation purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. Ready? Let's begin. Picture this, 900,000 years ago. The number itself is almost impossible to truly comprehend. If we imagine each year as a single footstep, walking back 900,000 years would take you around the Earth 36 times. This was deep time, an era so distant that the very continents beneath our ancestors' feet were subtly different from the ones we know today. The Mediterranean Sea periodically dried up and refilled. The Sahara Desert bloomed green with lakes and rivers, then withered back to sand, over and over again in cycles that lasted tens of thousands of years. Mountain ranges were measurably shorter. Rivers ran in different courses. The stars in the night sky formed slightly different constellations, as our solar system had travelled a different path through the spiral arm of the Milky Way. This was the early Pleistocene, though of course no living thing knew it by that name or any name at all. It was simply the world, vast and nameless and eternal seeming. The Earth was in the grip of gradual but profound changes. The planet was beginning its long, slow slide into the ice ages that would define the next million years. But this wasn't the dramatic, sudden freeze of disaster movies. This was something far more subtle and far more deadly. It was a creeping cold that advanced and retreated over millennia, reshaping entire ecosystems with the patience of geological time. In this ancient world our ancestors walked, they weren't quite us, these distant relatives. Scientists call them Homo erectus, though even that designation carries uncertainties and debates that continue to this day in quiet academic conferences and lengthy peer-reviewed papers. They stood upright, as we do. Their hands could craft tools, though simpler than anything we might recognize as technology. Their brains were smaller than ours, perhaps 2/3 the size, but already far larger than any apes. They had learned the profound magic of fire, that dancing orange spirit that pushed back the darkness and transformed inedible plants and tough meat into nourishment. They were human in all the ways that truly matter, yet different in ways we can only glimpse through the fragments they left behind. Imagine standing beside one of them on an African savanna at dusk. The air would be thick with the scent of dust and grass and the musk of countless animals. Your ancestor beside you would be shorter than most modern humans, perhaps 5 feet tall, with a body built for endless walking under the harsh sun. Their face would be both familiar and strange, with a heavy brow ridge shading intelligent eyes, a broad nose perfect for breathing in a hot climate, and a jaw more robust than any modern human's. If you looked into their eyes, you would see something recognizable, a spark of awareness, curiosity, perhaps even wonder. But their thoughts, their dreams, their fears, these remained forever beyond our reach, lost in the silence of deep time. The world they inhabited was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. This was the age of megafauna, when giants walked the earth. Elephants were not just the familiar species we know today, but a diverse family of massive creatures. There were straight-tusked elephants standing 13 feet tall at the shoulder. There were gomphotheras with 4 tusks, looking like something from an alien world. Mammoths were just beginning their evolutionary journey, still adapting to the cooling world. And these were just the elephants. The landscape teemed with enormous creatures that would seem like mythology to us now. Giant hyenas the size of modern lions, saber-toothed cats with fangs like curved daggers, bears that would dwarf the largest grizzly alive today, and in some parts of the world, giant ground sloths the size of elephants, moving with surreal slowness through ancient forests. Our ancestors were neither the strongest nor the fastest creatures in this world. They had no fangs, no claws, no venom, no wings. What they had was each other. They lived in small bands, perhaps 20 or 30 individuals who knew each other's faces, each other's gaits, each other's habits. They had language of some sort, though we can only guess at its complexity. Perhaps it was more sophisticated than we imagine, full of words for specific plants, animals, weather patterns, and social relationships. Or perhaps it was simpler, supplemented heavily by gestures, expressions, and shared understanding built over lifetimes spent together. They had culture, passed down through generations in ways that left no fossil record. How to nap the perfect hand axe, where to find water in the dry season, which plants could heal and which would kill, how to read the behavior of predators and prey. These were libraries of knowledge carried not in books but in minds, transferred from parent to child through patient demonstration and watchful learning. The rhythm of their lives was dictated entirely by nature. They woke with the sun and slept when darkness fell, though they might have sat around their fires for a time, the flames pushing back the night and creating a small circle of safety and warmth. They were nomadic by necessity, following the herds, the rains, the fruiting seasons of different plants. They knew their territory intimately, every water source, every sheltered spot, every cliff and valley and river crossing. This knowledge wasn't written or mapped, but lived in their memories and in their feet, which had walked these paths since childhood. Their tools were simple but effective. The hand axe was their Swiss Army knife, a teardrop-shaped piece of stone carefully chipped to create a sharp edge all around. With it they could butcher an animal, dig for tubers, shape wood, crack bones for marrow. They had wooden spears, though the wood has long since rotted away, leaving only the imagination to reconstruct them. Perhaps they had carrying bags made from animal hide or woven plant fibers. Perhaps they had already discovered the profound utility of the container, that simple technology that allows you to carry more than your hands can hold. But all of this organic technology has vanished, leaving only stone to tell the tale. They were hunters and gatherers, though the balance between these two activities remains a subject of scholarly debate. They certainly scavenged, driving predators away from fresh kills with fire and noise and numbers. They hunted using their intelligence and cooperation to bring down prey that no single human could defeat. But much of their diet probably came from plants, roots, tubers, fruits, nuts, seeds, leaves. The women, likely carrying infants and trailed by young children, might have provided the majority of the calories through their gathering, while the men's hunting provided essential proteins and fats. Or perhaps these roles were more fluid than we imagine, shaped by individual skill and circumstance rather than rigid tradition. Childhood in this ancient world was both shorter and longer than what we know today, shorter because children had to grow up fast, learning essential survival skills from the moment they could walk. A 5-year-old might already know which berries were safe to eat, how to find water-bearing plants, how to recognize the alarm calls of different animals. But childhood was also longer in the sense that the extended family, the band, all participated in raising the young. Children were surrounded by aunts and uncles, older cousins, grandparents if they were lucky enough to have them. Every adult was a teacher. Every day was a lesson in survival. Death was a constant companion in this world. Infant mortality was staggering by modern standards. Perhaps only half of children survived to adulthood. Women died in childbirth. Men died in hunting accidents. Everyone was vulnerable to infection, injury, predation, starvation. A broken bone could be a death sentence. An infected wound almost certainly was, yet they cared for each other. We have fossil evidence of individuals who survived for years with disabilities that would have made them unable to contribute to the group's survival. Someone with no teeth, requiring food to be specially prepared. Someone with a withered arm, unable to hunt or gather effectively. These individuals survived because others cared for them, shared food with them, protected them. This compassion, this care for the vulnerable, was already part of what made them human. The night must have been both terrifying and magnificent for them. Without any artificial light except their fires, the darkness was absolute. Every sound could be a predator approaching. Every shadow could hide death. But the night sky, unpolluted by any human light, would have been breathtaking. The Milky Way would have been a bright river across the sky. Shooting stars, planets, the slow wheel of the constellations through the seasons. Did they make up stories about the patterns in the stars? Did they wonder what those lights were? Did they feel, as we sometimes do, both insignificant and part of something vast and mysterious when they looked up at the night sky? We'll never know, but it's hard to imagine that beings intelligent enough to master fire and create tools didn't also wonder about their place in the cosmos. Their understanding of the world was probably a mixture of practical knowledge and what we might call spiritual or mythological thinking. They knew that rain followed certain signs in the sky and the behavior of animals. They knew that the moon waxed and waned in a predictable cycle. They knew that certain seasons brought certain foods and certain dangers. But what did they think caused these things? Did they have gods or spirits? Did they tell stories about how the world came to be? Did they honor their dead with rituals we might recognize as religious? The archaeological record is frustratingly silent on these questions. We have no cave paintings from this era, no carved figurines, no obvious burial sites. With grave goods, their spiritual lives, if they had them in any form we might recognize, left no trace we can read. Yet they must have had rich emotional lives. They knew joy and sorrow, fear and comfort, love and loss. Mothers must have sung to their babies, even if we'll never know the melodies. Friends must have laughed together at shared jokes, even if the humour is lost to time. Lovers must have felt that pull toward each other that every generation of humans has known. They grieved when loved ones died. They celebrated when children were born. They felt pride in a well-made tool or a successful hunt. They experienced the full range of human emotion in a world that was both their entire universe and just one tiny corner of a planet they couldn't imagine in its fullness. The landscape they moved through was constantly changing, though at a pace too slow for any individual to notice. Forests expanded and contracted with the shifting climate. Grasslands spread and retreated. Lakes appeared and disappeared. Rivers changed course. Mountains eroded particle by particle. The world was in constant flux, but at a tempo that made it seem eternal to eyes that would only see a few decades of it. Each generation inherited a world subtly different from their parents, but the changes were so gradual that tradition and knowledge could adapt. The waterhole your grandmother showed you was still there when you showed it to your granddaughter, even if it was slightly smaller or had shifted a few feet. The fruiting tree your father taught you to find still bore fruit when you taught your son, even if there were fewer of them than in the old stories. This was a world without waste. Everything was used. When they killed an animal, they ate the meat, cracked the bones for marrow, used the hide for clothing or carrying, turned sinew into string, fashioned bones into tools. When they moved camp, they left nothing behind but ashes and footprints. Their impact on the environment was so light that if every human had vanished on any given day, within a century there would have been almost no trace they had ever existed. The hand axes they left behind would have been the only durable evidence, and even these would have been scattered and buried by time and geology. They lived in a world of immediate consequences. Every decision mattered. Take the wrong path and you might walk into a pride of lions. Eat the wrong plant and you might die in agony. Fail to notice the signs of approaching weather and you might be caught in a killing storm. Trust the wrong person and the whole band might suffer. But get things right, make the correct choices, and you would eat tonight, sleep safely, see another sunrise. There was no safety net except the knowledge passed down through generations and the support of your small band. Every day was a test, and the price of failure was often death. And yet, they thrived. For hundreds of thousands of years before the great catastrophe we're about to explore, they spread across Africa and into Asia and Europe. They adapted to different climates, different ecosystems, different challenges. They were successful enough to leave descendants, to pass on their genes and their knowledge, to slowly, gradually become something new. They were our ancestors, the ones who would survive what was coming, though they had no way to know that their world was about to change in ways that would bring their species to the very brink of extinction. The world of 900,000 years ago was also a world of climate instability that was gradually intensifying. The Pleistocene was characterized by cycles of glaciation and warming, driven by subtle changes in Earth's orbit and axis. These Milankovitch cycles, as scientists now call them, created a complex pattern of climate change that affected every corner of the planet. When ice sheets grew in the north, Africa became drier. When the ice retreated, monsoons strengthened. These changes happened over thousands of years, slow enough that plants and animals could usually migrate and adapt, but fast enough that the world of one millennium might be dramatically different from another. Our ancestors had already survived several of these cycles. They had adapted to changing landscapes, shifting prey species, new predators, different plant communities. They were flexible, resourceful, capable of change. But what was coming would test them beyond anything their species had faced before. The signs were probably subtle at first. Perhaps the rains came later than usual one year, then failed entirely the next. Perhaps familiar plants became harder to find. Perhaps the herds they followed changed their migration patterns or declined in number. Perhaps new predators moved into their territory, or old ones became more desperate and dangerous as their own prey became scarce. For the individuals living through the beginning of this change, it might have seemed like just a run of bad luck, a harsh decade perhaps, but surely things would return to normal. The old people might have talked about similar hard times in their youth that had passed. The band might have moved to new territories, searching for better conditions. They might have had to eat foods they normally avoided, take greater risks in hunting, travel farther for water. But they would have adapted as they always had. They had no way to know that this wasn't just another fluctuation in the endless cycle of good years and bad years. They had no way to know that their entire species was entering a bottleneck that would squeeze them down to numbers so small that extinction would become a real possibility. In the generations before the collapse, life would have continued much as it always had. Children were born, learned the ways of their people, grew up, had children of their own, grew old if they were lucky, and died. Knowledge was passed down, tools were made and discarded, fires were lit and extinguished. The sun rose and set on a world that seemed as eternal and unchanging as the stars. But change was coming, carried on winds they couldn't predict, written in genetic code they couldn't read, building in atmospheric patterns they couldn't detect. The stable world their ancestors had known for thousands of generations was about to end. Consider for a moment the last generation before the collapse, the ones who would see the old world end but not live to see if a new one would begin. They would have been people just like us in all the ways that matter. They loved their children and worried about their futures. They took pride in their skills and knowledge. They found joy in small pleasures, a perfectly ripe fruit, a cool breeze on a hot day, the laughter of friends, the comfort of a fire on a cold night. They had no prophets to warn them, no scientist to explain what was happening, no historical record to show that species could disappear. They lived their lives as fully as they could in the only world they knew, unaware that they were standing on the edge of an abyss. The archaeological record from this period is frustratingly sparse. Stone tools tell us that humans were there, then their numbers dwindled, then they were almost gone. But the tools can't tell us about the fear, the desperation and the tough choices that must have been made. Did bands that had been enemies unite for survival? Did they turn on each other, competing for dwindling resources? Did they maintain their humanity, their compassion, their cooperation, even as their world collapsed around them? The stones are silent on these questions. What we do know is that something extraordinary happened around 900,000 years ago. The genetic evidence, which we'll explore in detail soon, tells us that the human population crashed to numbers so low that our entire species went through what scientists call a bottleneck. From perhaps hundreds of thousands of individuals spread across Africa and Eurasia, the population that would give rise to all modern humans shrank to maybe just 1,300 breeding individuals. Think about that number, 1,300 people capable of having children. That's smaller than many high schools. That's a crowd that could fit in a small theatre. That's few enough that everyone could know everyone else by name. The entire future of humanity, every person who would ever live, every civilization that would ever rise, every idea that would ever be thought by a human mind, all of it hung on the survival of this tiny group. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand the collapse, we need to understand how we know about it. The evidence doesn't come from fossils or tools or ancient campsites. It comes from something far more intimate and surprising. It comes from within us, from the DNA that every person watching this carries in every cell of their body. The story of the ancient catastrophe is written in our genes, waiting for scientists with the right tools and knowledge to read it. And that story, the story of how we discovered this ancient near extinction, is almost as remarkable as the event itself. The world before the bottleneck was rich with human variety. Different populations had adapted to different environments, developing unique characteristics, unique solutions to survival challenges, unique cultures and ways of life. There were probably forms of humanity that we'll never know about, branches of our family tree that were pruned away in the Great Dying. The humans who entered the bottleneck were the product of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution and adaptation. They were successful, diverse, spread across a vast range, and then, in what was essentially an instant in geological time, almost all of them were gone. Think of it like a library containing hundreds of thousands of books, each one unique, each one containing irreplaceable knowledge and stories. Then imagine a fire that destroys all but a single shelf. The few books that survive become infinitely precious, but the loss is incalculable. That's what happened to humanity 900,000 years ago. We're all descended from the few books that survived the fire, but we'll never know what wisdom and variety was lost. The survivors, those 1,300 or so individuals, were not necessarily the strongest or the smartest or the best in any measurable way. They were simply the ones who happened to be in the right place at the right time, or perhaps the wrong place at the right time, depending on how you look at it. They were the ones who, through luck or circumstance, or perhaps some small advantage we'll never understand, managed to find enough food, enough water, enough shelter, enough of each other to continue the chain of life that connects them to us. As we prepare to dive deeper into this story, to explore the genetic evidence and the theories about what caused this near extinction, it's worth pausing to consider the sheer improbability of our existence. Every single person alive today exists because those 1,300 individuals survived. If even one of them had died before reproducing, the entire course of human history would be different. You, specifically you, listening to this right now, are the product of an unbroken chain of survival stretching back through that bottleneck. Every one of your ancestors, without exception, survived long enough to have children. They survived the bottleneck, the ice ages that followed, predators, diseases, famines, wars, accidents, and countless other threats. The odds against your existence are so astronomical that mathematics fails to capture it. You're impossibly unlikely, and yet here you are, the living proof that sometimes the impossible happens. The genetic evidence for this ancient catastrophe wasn't discovered all at once in some dramatic moment of revelation. Instead, it emerged slowly, from decades of careful research, from thousands of scientists working on seemingly unrelated problems, from the gradual accumulation of data and the development of new techniques for analyzing it. The story of the discovery is a testament to human curiosity and ingenuity, to our desire to understand where we came from and how we came to be who we are. It started with puzzles that didn't seem to fit. Why do humans have so much less genetic diversity than our closest relatives, the other great apes? Why do all non-African populations seem to descend from a small group that left Africa relatively recently? Why do certain genetic patterns suggest a severe population reduction in our distant past? These questions nagged at geneticists and anthropologists, pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. But to understand how the pieces finally came together, we need to understand what genes actually tell us about the past. Your DNA is like a history book, but one written in a language that we're only just learning to read. Every cell in your body contains the story of your ancestors, encoded in 3 billion base pairs of genetic information. Most of this DNA is identical in all humans. The differences between any two people amount to only about 0.1% of their genome. But within that tiny percentage of difference lies the entire story of human diversity and human history. These small variations, called polymorphisms, are like timestamps and tracking devices, allowing scientists to trace when and where different populations diverged, mixed, and evolved. The key insight that led to the discovery of the ancient bottleneck was the realization that genetic diversity accumulates over time at a relatively steady rate. Mutations happen at random, most of them neutral, neither helpful nor harmful, just tiny copying errors that get passed down through generations. The more time that passes, the more mutations accumulate, the more diversity builds up in a population. But when a population goes through a bottleneck, when it shrinks dramatically, much of that diversity is lost. It's like shuffling a deck of cards, but only keeping a few cards from the shuffled deck to start a new game. No matter how many times you shuffle those few cards, you'll never have the variety you started with. Scientists began to notice that humans have surprisingly low genetic diversity for a species with our population size and geographic spread. Chimpanzees, despite numbering only in the hundreds of thousands and living in a much smaller area, have more genetic diversity than humans. This didn't make sense unless something had happened to reduce human genetic diversity at some point in our past. But when? And how severe was this reduction? The answer came from sophisticated computer models that could simulate different population histories and compare them to the actual genetic data. Scientists could ask, what would human DNA look like if there had been a bottleneck of a certain size at a certain time? They could run millions of simulations, each with slightly different parameters, and see which ones best match the real data. And consistently, the models pointed to a severe bottleneck sometime between 700,000 and 1 million years ago. But the real breakthrough came with the development of a new analytical technique called FitCoal, which could detect ancient demographic events with unprecedented precision. When researchers applied this technique to the genomes of thousands of people from populations around the world, The signal was unmistakable. Around 900,000 years ago, the effective population size of our ancestors crashed from around 100,000 individuals to just 1,300, and it stayed at that incredibly low level for over 100,000 years. This wasn't just a brief crisis. This was a prolonged near-extinction event that lasted longer than our entire species, Homo sapiens, has existed. The implications of this discovery were staggering. It meant that every human alive today is descended from a group of survivors that could have fit in a modern apartment building. It meant that for over 1,000 centuries humanity teetered on the edge of extinction. It meant that we are all, in a very real sense, cousins, related far more closely than the current human population size would suggest. The genetic evidence was telling us that we almost didn't make it, that the human story almost ended before it really began. But genes can only tell us that the bottleneck happened. They can't tell us why. For that, we need to turn to other evidence, to climate records and fossil sites and geological data. We need to piece together what was happening on Earth 900,000 years ago that could have brought our ancestors to the brink of extinction. And that's where our story becomes even more fascinating, because the Earth 900,000 years ago was undergoing one of the most dramatic climate transitions in the entire Pleistocene. The mid-Pleistocene transition, as scientists call it, was a fundamental reorganization of Earth's climate system. Before this transition, ice ages came and went on a roughly 41,000-year cycle, driven by changes in Earth's axial tilt. The ice ages were relatively mild and the warm periods between them were long and stable. But around 900,000 years ago, something changed. The cycles lengthened to about 100,000 years, and the ice ages became much more severe. Massive ice sheets grew to cover much of North America and Northern Europe. Sea levels dropped by hundreds of feet. The entire global climate system shifted to a new, harsher rhythm. For our ancestors in Africa, this global cooling would have meant devastating droughts. When water is locked up in ice sheets, there's less moisture in the atmosphere, less rain falling on the land. The lush savannas that had supported large human populations would have turned to desert, rivers would have dried up, lakes would have disappeared, the plants and animals that humans depended on would have died or migrated to the few remaining habitable areas. It would have been an ecological collapse on a scale that's hard to imagine. But climate change alone might not have been enough to cause such a severe bottleneck. After all, humans had survived climate changes before. Some scientists think that the bottleneck might have been caused by a combination of factors. Perhaps there was a massive volcanic eruption that plunged the world into a volcanic winter, adding sudden catastrophe to gradual climate change. Perhaps there was a pandemic, a disease that spread through the already stressed population. Perhaps there was increased competition from other hominin species, or from predators adapting to the same shrinking resources. The truth is, we don't know for certain, and we may never know. The evidence is too fragmentary, the time too distant. What we do know is that somehow, somewhere, a small group of humans found a way to survive. They found a refuge, a place where water still flowed and food could still be found. They managed to maintain a breeding population, however precariously. They kept the flame of human consciousness burning through the long darkness. And eventually, after over 100,000 years, they began to recover, to expand, to reclaim the world that their ancestors had almost lost. This recovery wasn't immediate or easy. The genetic evidence suggests that the population remained small and vulnerable for thousands of generations. Every death was a tragedy not just for the individual and their loved ones, but for the species as a whole. Every birth was precious beyond measure. The margin for error was essentially zero. One bad decade, one virulent disease, one conflict that got out of hand, and humanity would have vanished forever, leaving the Earth to the other branches of the evolutionary tree. During this long bottleneck, our ancestors would have been forced to adapt in ways that shaped us profoundly. With such a small population, inbreeding would have been inevitable. Harmful recessive genes would have been exposed and eliminated by natural selection. beneficial mutations would have spread quickly through the entire population. The bottleneck acted like a filter, allowing only certain genetic variants to pass through. We are the products of that filtering, shaped by the constraints and opportunities of that ancient crisis. Some scientists speculate that the bottleneck might have actually accelerated human evolution. With such a small population, genetic drift, random changes in gene frequency, would have been much more powerful than in a large population. New mutations that might have been diluted to insignificance in a large population could become fixed in a small one. The extreme selective pressures of this bottleneck environment would have favoured innovations in behaviour, cognition and social organisation. It's possible that the humans who emerged from the bottleneck were fundamentally different from those who entered it, transformed by their passage through the evolutionary crucible. The bottleneck might also explain one of the great mysteries of human evolution, the apparent sudden appearance of our last common ancestor with Neanderthals and Denisovans. Genetic evidence suggests that modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans, all descend from a common ancestor who lived around 800,000 years ago, right after the bottleneck ended. It's possible that the bottleneck event actually created this ancestor, that the small surviving population evolved into a new species that would eventually give rise to all later humans. We might owe our very existence as a species to this near-extinction event. Think about what this means. Every human trait that distinguishes us from other animals, every capacity that makes us unique, might be the result of this ancient crisis. Our large brains, our complex language, our ability to cooperate in large groups, our creativity, our ability to imagine and plan for the future, all of these might have been forged in the crucible of near extinction. We are who we are not in spite of almost going extinct, but because of it. The world that our ancestors emerged into after the bottleneck was different from the one their ancestors had known. The climate had shifted to a new, harsher regime. Many of the large animals that had shared their world were gone, victims of the same changes that had nearly eliminated humans. The ecological niches that humans had occupied were changed or eliminated. They had to find new ways to survive, new strategies for making a living in a transformed world, and they did. Slowly, gradually, generation by generation. They spread out from their refuge, reclaiming old territories and discovering new ones. But they carried with them the genetic legacy of the bottleneck, the loss of diversity, the genetic scars of inbreeding, the adaptations forced by extreme conditions. All of these became part of the human inheritance. Every person alive today carries these marks in their DNA, invisible but indelible, connecting us to those desperate survivors 900,000 years ago. We're all children of the bottleneck, shaped by an event that none of us remember, but all of us embody. As we think about this ancient catastrophe and its role in shaping humanity, it's natural to wonder what would have happened if it hadn't occurred. Would humans be more diverse, more varied, if we hadn't lost 99% of our ancestral population? Would there be different species of humans sharing the planet with us, descendants of lineages that were lost in the bottleneck? Would human history have unfolded differently if we hadn't been forced through this evolutionary funnel? These are questions without answers, alternative histories, that exist only in our imagination. But there's another way to think about the bottleneck. Every catastrophe is also an opportunity. Every ending is also a beginning. The humans who survived the bottleneck were the founders of a new chapter in the human story. They were the ancestors not just of us, but of every human achievement, every work of art, every scientific discovery, every act of love and kindness and creativity that has ever been performed by human hands and minds. The bottleneck nearly ended the human story, but it also began the story that led to us sitting here today, contemplating our own origins. The genetic evidence continues to accumulate, and our understanding of the bottleneck continues to evolve. New techniques for analysing ancient DNA are revealing more details about population sizes and movements. Climate scientists are reconstructing ancient weather patterns with increasing precision. Archaeologists are finding new sites that might hold clues to how and where our ancestors survived. The story we're telling tonight is not the final version. It's a work in progress, a scientific mystery that we're still solving. But even with all the uncertainties, the basic fact remains. 900,000 years ago, our ancestors nearly went extinct. They survived by the narrowest of margins, through a combination of luck, resilience, and perhaps some qualities we'll never fully understand. And because they survived, we exist. Every person who has ever lived owes their existence to those few survivors. Every human accomplishment, from the first cave painting to landing on the moon, was made possible by their survival. Every moment of human joy and sorrow, every birth and death, every dream and disappointment, all of it flows from that ancient moment when humanity hung by a thread and the thread held. This is the kind of story that can change how we see ourselves and our place in the world. We often think of humans as inevitable, as the destined rulers of the planet, as the purpose toward which evolution was aiming. But the bottleneck reminds us that we were never guaranteed. We are not the inevitable result of evolutionary progress, but the unlikely survivors of an ancient catastrophe. Our existence is not a right but a gift, passed down from those desperate survivors to us across 900,000 years. And perhaps this perspective can offer us some wisdom for our own time. We live in an age of unprecedented human success. Our population has grown from those 1,300 survivors to 8 billion. We've spread to every continent, adapted to every environment, even left the planet temporarily to walk on the moon. We've developed technology that would seem like magic to our ancestors. We've accumulated knowledge that allows us to peer back in time and understand our own origins. But we've also developed the capacity to create our own bottlenecks through nuclear war, climate change, or other existential risks. The story of the ancient bottleneck is both a warning and an inspiration. It's a warning that even successful species can come to the brink of extinction, that the world can change in ways that challenge survival itself. But it's also an inspiration, a reminder that humans have survived seemingly impossible odds before. Those 1,300 survivors didn't have science or technology or any understanding of what was happening to them. They had only their intelligence, their social bonds, and their will to survive. And it was enough. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine them, those ancient survivors whose names we'll never know, but whose legacy we all carry. Picture them around their fires, small points of light in a vast darkness, not knowing if their species would survive another generation. Picture them caring for their children, sharing their meager food, maintaining hope in the face of despair. Picture them as what they were, the most important humans who ever lived, though they could never have known it. They are the forgotten ancestors who gave us everything simply by refusing to give up. The genetic ghost of their near extinction whispers to us across the millennia, encoded in every cell of our bodies. It tells us that we are all family, all descendants of the same small group of survivors. It tells us that existence is precious and precarious, that survival is never guaranteed. It tells us that even in the darkest times when hope seems lost, life can find a way. The bottleneck that nearly ended humanity also created humanity as we know it. We are who we are because our ancestors survived the unsurvivable. And now, as we prepare to journey deeper into this story, to explore the climate catastrophe that may have caused the bottleneck and the evolutionary consequences that followed, remember that this is not just ancient history. This is your story, your heritage, your genetic inheritance. The DNA in your body is a library of survival, each gene a story of ancestors who faced death and chose life, who faced extinction and chose to continue. You're here because they were strong enough, lucky enough, stubborn enough to survive. You're the living proof that sometimes, against all odds, life finds a way. The world of 900,000 years ago has vanished completely. The landscapes have been reshaped by erosion and tectonics. The ice sheets have advanced and retreated dozens of times. The rivers have changed course. The mountains have worn down. Even the stars have shifted in the sky. But the genetic echo of that world lives on in us. We carry it everywhere we go, an ancient message written in the language of DNA, telling us about a time when humanity nearly ended, and then, miraculously, began again. After the long winter of near extinction, after generations beyond counting had lived and died in the shadow of catastrophe, something began to change. The genetic evidence tells us that around 800,000 years ago, the population that had been squeezed down to those desperate 1,300 individuals began, slowly, tentatively, to grow again. This wasn't a sudden explosion of numbers, not a dramatic reversal of fortune. It was more like the first green shoots appearing after a forest fire, fragile and uncertain, but carrying within them the promise of renewal. The question that has captivated scientists for decades is not just how our ancestors survived the bottleneck, but where. Where on this vast planet did humanity's last stand take place? What special characteristics did this place have that allowed it to shelter our species when the rest of the world had become uninhabitable for humans? The concept of refugia, safe havens where species survive during periods of environmental catastrophe, is well established in biology. During ice ages, tropical species retreat to small pockets near the equator. During droughts, water-dependent species cluster around the few remaining water sources. During volcanic winters or asteroid impacts, life persists in scattered sanctuaries where conditions remain just barely tolerable. For our ancestors 900,000 years ago, finding and holding on to such refugia wasn't just important. It was the difference between existence and extinction. These places, wherever they were, became the nurseries of all future humanity. The search for humanity's ancient refugia is like trying to solve a mystery where most of the clues have been erased by time. We can't simply dig up a sign that says humans survived here. The archaeological record from this period is frustratingly sparse. Stone tools tell us where humans were present, but the absence of tools doesn't necessarily mean the absence of humans. Perhaps populations were so small and mobile that they left no durable traces. Perhaps the refugia were in places where geological processes have destroyed or deeply buried any evidence. Perhaps we simply haven't looked in the right places yet. But by combining multiple lines of evidence, genetic data, climate models, fossil discoveries, and ecological reconstructions, scientists are beginning to piece together a picture of where and how our ancestors might have survived. The genetic evidence provides some tantalizing hints. The pattern of genetic diversity in modern African populations suggests that the survivors of the bottleneck were probably located somewhere in Africa, rather than in Eurasia, where earlier humans had also spread. This makes sense from a climate perspective as well. While the global cooling of the mid-Pleistocene transition would have made much of Eurasia uninhabitable for tropical adapted humans, parts of Africa would have remained warm enough for survival. But Africa is enormous, larger than China, the United States and Europe combined. Where specifically within this vast continent did our ancestors find refuge? One possibility that has captured the imagination of many researchers is the African Rift Valley system. This enormous geological feature, stretching from the Red Sea to Mozambique, creates a variety of microclimates and ecological niches. The valley floors, lying below the surrounding highlands, would have been warmer than the plateaus during cold periods. The numerous lakes in the rift system, even if they shrank during dry periods, would have provided reliable water sources. The volcanic soils are exceptionally fertile, supporting diverse plant life even during harsh times. The varied topography would have offered different resources at different elevations, allowing populations to move up and down the slopes as conditions changed. It's a landscape of possibilities, where even during a global catastrophe, pockets of habitability might have persisted. Imagine our ancestors living in one of these Rift Valley refugia during the worst of the bottleneck. Perhaps they occupied a territory centered on a shrinking but persistent lake, its waters fed by springs that never quite ran dry even during the worst droughts. The lake would have been the heart of their world, providing not just water, but attracting animals that they could hunt or scavenge. Along its shores, edible plants would have grown even when the surrounding highlands turned to desert. Fish, shellfish, and aquatic plants would have provided crucial protein and nutrients when terrestrial game became scarce. The lake would have been their lifeline, their anchor, the armed constant in a world of devastating change. But a single lake, even a large one, might not have been enough to support even a small human population for over 100,000 years. More likely, the refugium consisted of a network of interconnected habitable zones. Perhaps there were several lakes within walking distance of each other, allowing the population to move between them as water levels fluctuated. Perhaps there were riverside forests that survived, even when the surrounding savannas turned to desert, green corridors that connected different resource patches. Perhaps there were highland areas that caught enough moisture to support vegetation even during the driest periods, islands of green in an ocean of brown. The social dynamics within these refugia would have been unlike anything our ancestors had experienced before. With the total human population so small, every individual would have been precious. The normal fission-fusion dynamics of hunter-gatherer societies, where groups split when they become too large or when conflicts arise, would have been constrained by the simple fact that there were no other groups to join. Everyone was related to everyone else, not in the abstract way that all humans are related, but in immediate genealogical ways. Your mate was your cousin, your hunting partner was your brother-in-law and your second cousin. Your child's potential mates were all relatives of varying degrees. This extreme inbreeding would have had profound genetic consequences, many of them negative. Harmful recessive alleles that are normally masked by dominant healthy versions would have been exposed when individuals inherited the same recessive allele from both parents. Genetic diseases that are rare in large populations would have become common. Infant mortality, already high in prehistoric populations, would have soared even higher. Many pregnancies would have ended in miscarriage as lethal genetic combinations expressed themselves. The survivors would have been those who, by chance, avoided the worst genetic combinations, or who carried compensatory mutations that mitigated the harmful effects of inbreeding. But the small population size and inbreeding might have had some unexpected benefits as well. Beneficial mutations that arose during this period would have had a much better chance of spreading through the entire population than they would in a larger group. Natural selection would have been incredibly efficient at eliminating harmful variants and promoting beneficial ones. The extreme conditions would have favored innovations, genetic, behavioral, and cultural, that improved survival odds. In a sense, the bottleneck acted as an evolutionary accelerator, compressing changes that might normally take millions of years into a much shorter time frame. The refugia would have selected for specific traits that enhance survival in these constrained environments. Perhaps they favored individuals who were better at extracting nutrients from marginal foods, who could survive on less water, who were more resistant to local diseases. Perhaps they selected for enhanced cooperation, since conflict in such a small population could be fatal for everyone. Perhaps they favored improved communication skills, since coordinating activities efficiently would have been crucial when margins for error were so slim. We can only speculate about the specific selective pressures, but we know that the humans who emerged from the refugia were different from those who entered them. One intriguing possibility is that the refugia might have been coastal areas rather than, or in addition to, inland sites. The ocean provides a buffer against climate extremes, keeping coastal areas warmer in cold periods and cooler in hot periods. More importantly, marine resources like shellfish, fish, and seaweed provide reliable nutrition even when terrestrial ecosystems collapse. The archaeological record shows that later human populations often thrived in coastal areas, and there's no reason to think our ancient ancestors couldn't have done the same. The problem is that the coastlines of 900,000 years ago are now deep underwater, submerged by rising sea levels during interglacial periods. If our ancestors' refugia were coastal, most of the evidence is now inaccessible, lying on the ocean floor under hundreds of feet of water. There's also the possibility that the refugia weren't fixed locations but rather mobile zones that shifted with changing conditions. Perhaps our ancestors survived by following the habitable zones as they moved across the landscape in response to climate fluctuations. During wetter periods, they might have expanded into semi-arid areas. During drier periods, they might have contracted back to core areas around permanent water. This mobile refugium hypothesis would explain why it's so hard to find archaeological evidence of where the bottleneck population lived. They weren't in one place long enough to leave a substantial archaeological signature. The refugia, wherever and whatever they were, would have become the stage for one of the most important evolutionary transitions in human history. Because it was during or immediately after the bottleneck that something remarkable happened. The genetic evidence suggests that the small population that survived the bottleneck didn't just recover their numbers. They transformed into something new. They became the last common ancestor of all later human populations, including not just our own species, Homo sapiens, but also our extinct cousins, the Neanderthals and Denisovans. This transformation is one of the most fascinating aspects of the bottleneck story, and to understand it, we need to delve into the complex world of human evolutionary genetics. The concept of a last common ancestor is fundamental to understanding evolutionary relationships. Every group of related organisms, whether they're different species, different populations, or different individuals, shares a common ancestor at some point in the past. For humans, chimpanzees, and bonobos, that common ancestor lived about 7 million years ago. For all primates, it was about 55 million years ago. For all mammals, about 100 million years ago. The further back you go, the larger the group that shares the ancestor. But what makes the last common ancestor of modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans, special is that this ancestor appeared surprisingly recently, only about 800,000 years ago, right around the time the bottleneck was ending. This timing is probably not a coincidence. The extreme evolutionary pressures of the bottleneck, the small population size that allowed new mutations to spread quickly, the novel selective environment of the refugia, all of these factors would have accelerated evolutionary change. The humans who emerged from the bottleneck weren't just survivors of the old species, they were the founders of a new one. They had crossed an evolutionary threshold, accumulating enough genetic and perhaps behavioral changes to be considered a distinct species from their pre-bottleneck ancestors. What exactly changed during this transformation? The fossil record from this period is sparse, but we can make some educated guesses based on the characteristics shared by all descendant populations. Brain size probably increased, as all later humans have larger brains than earlier Homo erectus. The shape of the skull likely changed, becoming more globular and less elongated. The face probably became flatter, with smaller teeth and jaws, suggesting changes in diet or food processing techniques. The postcranial skeleton, everything below the head, might have become more gracile, less robust, possibly indicating improved tool use that reduced the need for pure physical strength. But the most important changes might not have been physical at all. They might have been cognitive and behavioral. The bottleneck would have placed enormous pressure on social cooperation and communication. With such a small population, every individual's contribution was crucial. There was no room for freeloaders or persistent conflict. Groups that cooperated better, that communicated more effectively, that could plan and coordinate complex activities, would have had a massive survival advantage. The bottleneck might have been the crucible in which the enhanced social cognition that characterizes all later humans was forged. Language, that unique human capability that allows us to share complex information, coordinate activities, and transmit culture across generations, might have undergone a crucial transformation during the bottleneck. Perhaps before the bottleneck, our ancestors had some form of proto-language, simple but functional. The extreme pressures of survival in the refugia might have selected for enhanced linguistic abilities. Groups that could communicate more precisely, that could share information about resources and dangers more effectively, that could plan and strategize together, would have outcompeted groups with less sophisticated communication. The bottleneck might have been where human language as we know it was born. The archaeological record provides some tantalizing hints about behavioral changes around this time. After about 800,000 years ago, we begin to see new types of stone tools, more sophisticated and varied than before. We see evidence of humans adapting to a wider range of environments. We see signs of increased planning depth, such as the transport of raw materials over longer distances. These changes suggest that the humans who emerged from the bottleneck were cognitively different from their ancestors, capable of more complex thought and behavior. The genetic architecture of the new species would have been fundamentally shaped by the bottleneck. The loss of genetic diversity meant that all descendant populations would share certain characteristics simply because they all inherited them from the same small group of ancestors. But the bottleneck also created the potential for rapid divergence once populations began to expand and spread. With reduced genetic variation, different populations would be more likely to follow different evolutionary trajectories as they adapted to new environments. The seeds of the later divergence between Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans were sown in the genetic reshuffling of the bottleneck. One of the most intriguing aspects of this transformation is the possibility that the bottleneck population might have hybridized with other hominin populations as they began to expand out of their refugia. We know from genetic evidence that later human populations, including our own ancestors, interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans. It's possible that similar hybridization events occurred as the bottleneck population encountered other groups that had survived in different refugia. These hybridization events would have introduced new genetic variation into the bottleneck population, potentially accelerating their evolution and adaptation. The transformation from the bottleneck survivors to the last common ancestor wasn't instantaneous. It would have taken many generations, perhaps thousands of years, for the new characteristics to become fixed in the population. During this time, the population would have been in flux, with different traits appearing, spreading, and either being retained or lost. It would have been a period of intense evolutionary experimentation, with natural selection rapidly sorting through the available variation to craft a new kind of human. The refugia where this transformation took place would have been more than just safe havens. They would have been evolutionary laboratories, places where the future of humanity was being shaped by the intersection of genes, environment, and chance. Every birth was an experiment. Every death was a data point. Every successful adaptation was incorporated into the growing repertoire of human capabilities. The refugia were where humanity was reborn, not just demographically, but evolutionarily. As the climate began to stabilize and improve around 800,000 years ago, the descendants of the bottleneck population would have begun to explore beyond their refugia. At first, these explorations would have been tentative, seasonal perhaps, testing the waters of the wider world. But as populations grew and resources in the refugia became stretched, some groups would have made the decision to leave permanently, to seek new territories in the recovering world. These pioneers, venturing into landscapes that had been empty of humans for thousands of generations, were carrying with them the genetic and cultural innovations forged in the crucible of near extinction. The expansion out of the refugia would have been slow at first. Each new territory would have presented unique challenges requiring new adaptations. Groups would have had to learn new hunting techniques for unfamiliar prey, identify new plant foods, adapt to different climates and seasons. Many expansion attempts probably failed, with groups either dying out or retreating back to familiar territories, but some succeeded, establishing new populations that would themselves become sources of further expansion. The recolonization of the world by the descendants of the bottleneck population would take hundreds of thousands of years, but it began in those first tentative steps outside the refugia. As populations spread and grew, they would have begun to diverge from each other. Groups that moved into Europe would face different selective pressures than those that stayed in Africa or moved into Asia. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these different populations would accumulate different mutations, develop different adaptations, eventually becoming different species: Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in Eastern Asia, and Homo sapiens in Africa. But all of them would carry the legacy of the bottleneck, the genetic and perhaps cultural inheritance from those 1300 survivors. The refugia themselves would have remained important long after the bottleneck ended. They would have been the demographic and genetic reservoirs from which waves of expansion pulsed out whenever conditions permitted. During subsequent climate crises, and there were many in the following hundreds of thousands of years, populations might have retreated back to these proven safe havens. The refugia would have been like anchors, holding the human presence in place even as populations in marginal areas appeared and disappeared with climate fluctuations. The memory of the refugia might even have persisted in some form in the cultural traditions of the expanding populations, not as explicit historical knowledge, of course, but perhaps as a deep cultural attraction to certain types of landscapes. The human preference for savanna-like environments, with scattered trees and open grasslands, might reflect the landscapes where our ancestors survived the bottleneck. Our attraction to water features, lakes, rivers, coastlines, might echo the crucial role that water bodies played in the refugia. These preferences, now aesthetic and emotional, might once have been matters of survival. The story of the refugia and the transformation they hosted is still being written by scientists. New genetic techniques are revealing ever more detail about population sizes and relationships. New archaeological discoveries are filling in gaps in our understanding of where humans lived and how they adapted. New climate models are helping us understand what conditions were like in different parts of the world during the bottleneck. Each new piece of evidence adds detail to the picture, though the full image remains frustratingly incomplete. But even with all the uncertainties, the basic story is clear. Somewhere in Africa, probably in multiple connected locations, small groups of humans found places where they could survive when the rest of their species was dying out. These refugia became the crucibles where a new kind of human was forged, shaped by the extreme selective pressures of near extinction. The humans who emerged from these refugia were not the same as those who had entered them. They were something new, the ancestors of all later humans, including ourselves. The refugia were not just places of survival, but places of transformation, where the future of humanity was determined by the intersection of geography, climate, genetics, and chance. The concept of refugia also offers us a different perspective on human evolution. We often think of evolution as a gradual process, with changes accumulating slowly over millions of years. But the bottleneck and its refugia show us that evolution can also proceed in pulses, with long periods of stasis interrupted by rapid change during crises. The refugia were evolutionary accelerators, compressing millions of years of normal evolution into thousands of years of intense selection. They show us that sometimes the most important evolutionary events happen not in large, successful populations, but in small, stressed ones clinging to survival in marginal environments. The refugia also remind us of the importance of place in human history. We are shaped not just by our genes and our culture, but by the landscapes we inhabit. The specific characteristics of the refugia, their climate, topography, resources and challenges, became incorporated into the human genome and perhaps into human culture. We are, in a very real sense, products of those ancient landscapes, shaped by places that no longer exist in the same form, but that live on in our DNA and perhaps in our deepest psychological preferences. As we continue our journey through this ancient story, moving from the refugia and transformation to the lasting consequences of the bottleneck, it's worth pausing to imagine those places as they might have been. Picture a small lake in the African Rift Valley, its waters shimmering in the harsh sun of an ice age drought. Around its shores, a few dozen humans go about their daily lives, unaware that they are the last of their kind, that the entire future of humanity depends on their survival. They gather plants, hunt small game, teach their children, care for their sick, mourn their dead. They are not heroes in any conventional sense, just people trying to survive in a harsh world. But they are the most important people who ever lived, the ones who carried the human flame through the darkness and passed it on to us. The refugia are gone now, transformed by hundreds of thousands of years of geological and climatic change. The lakes have dried up or moved. The forests have become grasslands or deserts. The very continents have shifted slightly. But the legacy of those places lives on in every human being. We are all children of the refugia, shaped by the constraints and opportunities of those ancient sanctuaries. When we feel drawn to certain landscapes, when we find peace by water or shelter in valleys, we might be feeling an echo of our ancestors' experience in the refugia, a genetic memory of the places that saved our species. The transformation that occurred in the refugia was not just biological, but also possibly cultural and cognitive. The small population size would have meant that cultural innovations, new ways of making tools, processing food or organizing social relationships could spread quickly through the entire group. There would have been no isolated populations maintaining old traditions. Everyone would have known everyone else, would have seen every innovation, would have participated in every cultural change. The refugia might have been where human culture as we know it was born, where the capacity for cumulative cultural evolution that distinguishes humans from all other species first emerged. Think about what this means for understanding ourselves. Every human capacity, from our ability to learn languages to our tendency to form complex social hierarchies, from our artistic impulses to our scientific curiosity, might have been shaped by the experiences of a few hundred people in ancient African refugia. The universals of human nature, the characteristics that all humans share regardless of culture or upbringing, might reflect the selective pressures and random genetic changes that occurred during the bottleneck. We are who we are not because of some cosmic plan or evolutionary destiny, but because of the specific challenges and opportunities faced by a tiny group of survivors in a particular place and time. The refugia also offers a model for thinking about current and future challenges. As we face our own global crises, from climate change to biodiversity loss to potential pandemics, the story of the ancient refugia reminds us that survival often depends on finding or creating safe havens where life can persist through catastrophe. It reminds us that small populations in marginal environments can be sources of innovation and renewal. It reminds us that what seems like the end might actually be a transformation, a passage through a narrow gate into a different future. But perhaps most importantly, the refugia remind us of the power of place to shape destiny. The specific characteristics of those ancient sanctuaries, their particular combination of resources and challenges, determine the trajectory of human evolution. Had the refugia been different, had they been in different locations or had different characteristics, humanity might have evolved differently. We might have larger or smaller brains, different social structures, different cognitive abilities. The refugia were not just stages where human evolution played out, but active participants in shaping that evolution. As our ancestors began to expand out of the refugia, they would have carried with them not just genes, but memories, stories, traditions, and ways of understanding the world that had been forged in those sanctuaries. These cultural elements would have been just as important as genes in determining the success of expanding populations. Groups that maintained strong social cohesion, that preserved and transmitted useful knowledge, that adapted their refugia-born traditions to new environments, would have been more successful than those that didn't. The cultural legacy of the refugia would have spread along with the genetic legacy, shaping human societies for generations to come. The expansion out of the refugia would have been one of the great adventures in human history, though no one at the time would have seen it that way. Each generation would have moved just a little farther from the ancestral homeland, following game trails or seasonal resources, finding new valleys or coastlines that could support human life. Over centuries and millennia, these small movements would have added up to continental migrations. The descendants of the bottleneck survivors would have rediscovered lands that their distant ancestors had inhabited before the catastrophe, finding stone tools and perhaps even fossils of their predecessors, evidence of a lost world they could no longer fully understand. Some of these expanding populations would have encountered other hominins who had survived the bottleneck in different refugia. These meetings would have been among the most consequential in human history, determining whether different human lineages would remain separate or merge through interbreeding. The genetic evidence suggests that at least some interbreeding occurred, with genes flowing between populations that had been separated for thousands of generations. These hybrid individuals, carrying genetic innovations from multiple lineages, might have had advantages that promoted their survival and reproduction, spreading hybrid vigor through the expanding populations. The story of the refugia and the transformation they hosted is ultimately a story about resilience and adaptation. It shows us that life, and specifically human life, can survive almost anything if it can find or create the right conditions. It shows us that catastrophe can be creative, forcing innovations that would never have occurred in stable conditions. It shows us that who we are as a species was determined not by grand design, but by the contingencies of survival in specific places under specific conditions. We are accident and adaptation, chance and necessity, wrapped up in DNA and expressed in the infinite variety of human existence. Moving forward from the refugia, from the transformation of the bottleneck survivors into the last common ancestor, we begin to see the consequences of this ancient near extinction playing out over hundreds of thousands of years. The genetic, physical, and perhaps cultural changes that occurred during and immediately after the bottleneck would shape everything that came after. Every human achievement and failure, every migration and settlement, every innovation and tradition would be influenced by the legacy of those 1,300 survivors and the refugia that sheltered them. The bottleneck didn't just nearly end the human story, it rewrote it, creating a new narrative that continues to this day. The scars and gifts of the bottleneck are written not just in our genes but in our behavior, our psychology, our social structures, and our relationship with the world around us. To understand these lasting consequences, we need to examine how the bottleneck continues to influence human biology and culture nearly 1 million years later. We need to explore how an event that none of us remember, that occurred before our species even existed, continues to shape who we are and how we live. The bottleneck is not just ancient history. It's a living presence in every human being, an invisible hand guiding our evolution and development even today. Consider first the most obvious legacy of the bottleneck, our remarkably low genetic diversity. Humans are one of the most genetically uniform species on the planet, despite our large population and global distribution. Any two humans, regardless of how different they might appear, share about 99.9% of their DNA. Compare this to our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, who despite having a much smaller population confined to a relatively small area of Africa, have significantly more genetic diversity than all humans combined. This pattern makes no sense unless something dramatic happened to reduce human genetic diversity at some point in our past. That something was the bottleneck. The low genetic diversity caused by the bottleneck has had profound consequences for human evolution and health. On one hand, it means that all humans are remarkably similar at a genetic level, which might have contributed to our ability to cooperate and communicate across populations. We're all cousins, separated by only a few thousand generations from common ancestors. This genetic similarity might underlie the universal aspects of human nature, the behaviors and preferences that all humans share regardless of culture. On the other hand, low genetic diversity makes us vulnerable to diseases that can affect all humans similarly. a pathogen that evolves to exploit human biology faces a relatively uniform target population, which is one reason why pandemic diseases can spread so effectively through human populations. The bottleneck also left us with what geneticists call a high genetic load, an accumulation of slightly harmful mutations that reduce fitness, but aren't severe enough to be immediately eliminated by natural selection. In the small bottleneck population, these mildly deleterious mutations could become fixed simply through random chance, a process called genetic drift. Once fixed in the small population, these mutations were passed on to all descendants. Every human today carries hundreds of these slightly harmful mutations, a genetic burden inherited from the bottleneck. Some scientists estimate that humans have accumulated so many deleterious mutations since the bottleneck that our genetic fitness is significantly lower than it would be in a species that hadn't gone through such an event. But the bottleneck also gave us gifts, genetic and otherwise. The extreme selective pressures of near extinction would have rapidly eliminated severely harmful mutations while promoting beneficial ones. The small population size would have allowed beneficial mutations to spread quickly to all individuals. Some of the characteristics that define modern humans, our large brains, our extended childhood, our capacity for language, our social intelligence, might have been innovations that arose and became fixed during or shortly after the bottleneck. We might owe our humanity itself to the evolutionary crucible of near extinction. One of the most intriguing possibilities is that the bottleneck might have selected for enhanced cooperation and reduced aggression within groups. In a population of only 1,300 individuals, violent conflict would have been catastrophic. Groups that could manage conflicts peacefully, that could cooperate effectively despite stress and scarcity, would have had a massive survival advantage. This might explain why humans, despite our capacity for violence, are actually remarkably cooperative compared to our closest primate relatives. We're able to live in large groups of unrelated individuals, cooperate with strangers, and build complex societies based on shared rules and norms. These abilities might be direct legacies of the bottleneck, when cooperation wasn't just beneficial, but essential for survival. The bottleneck might also have influenced human mating patterns and family structures. With such a small population, finding a mate who wasn't closely related would have been challenging. This might have selected for behaviors and preferences that minimized the harmful effects of inbreeding, such as dispersal behaviors that took individuals away from their birth groups to find mates. The human tendency for female exogamy, where women leave their birth group to join their husband's group, might have origins in the bottleneck period when such behavior would have been crucial for avoiding excessive inbreeding. The strong human incest taboo, which appears to be universal across cultures, might also be a legacy of the bottleneck, a behavioral adaptation that reduced the likelihood of harmful inbreeding. The extended human childhood, unique among primates, might also be connected to the bottleneck. In a small population where every individual is precious, investing heavily in each offspring makes evolutionary sense. The long period of dependency that characterizes human children allows for extensive learning and socialization, ensuring that each child acquires the full range of survival skills and cultural knowledge. This extended childhood requires significant parental investment and often involves help from other relatives and community members, a cooperative breeding system that might have been essential in the small bottleneck population, where losing even a single child could be demographically catastrophic. Our remarkable adaptability, the ability of humans to survive in virtually every terrestrial environment on Earth, might also be a gift from the bottleneck. The refugia where our ancestors survived would have been characterized by environmental instability, with conditions changing dramatically over time. Individuals who were behaviorally flexible, who could adjust their strategies based on changing conditions, who could innovate when traditional approaches failed, would have been more likely to survive. This flexibility, this capacity for innovation and adaptation, became built into the human genome and human culture. We are generalists rather than specialists because our ancestors had to be to survive the changing conditions of the refugia. The bottleneck might have influenced human cognition in profound ways. The small population size would have meant that everyone knew everyone else personally. Social intelligence, the ability to track relationships, predict behavior, manage alliances, and navigate complex social dynamics, would have been crucial. The human brain's remarkable capacity for social cognition, our ability to understand others' mental states, predict their behavior, and coordinate complex group activities, might have been honed in the intense social environment of the bottleneck population. We are social animals not just by choice but by evolutionary necessity, shaped by a time when social isolation meant certain death. Language, that defining characteristic of humanity, was almost certainly influenced by the bottleneck. While we don't know exactly when full human language evolved, the bottleneck would have created strong selective pressures for enhanced communication. In a small population facing existential challenges, the ability to share complex information accurately would have been invaluable. Groups that could communicate about distant resources, coordinate hunting strategies, share knowledge about medicinal plants, or plan for future contingencies would have had significant advantages. The bottleneck might have been the crucible where human language evolved from simple proto-language to the complex, recursive, infinitely expressive system we use today. The bottleneck's influence extends beyond biology to culture and technology. The small population size would have meant that cultural innovations could spread quickly to everyone. There would have been no isolated groups maintaining old traditions while others innovated. This might have established the pattern of cumulative cultural evolution that characterizes human societies, where innovations build on previous innovations in an ever-accelerating process. The bottleneck might have been where humans first developed the capacity for what anthropologists call ratcheting, the ability to preserve and build upon cultural innovations across generations rather than having to reinvent everything anew. The psychological impacts of the bottleneck might still influence us today. The deep human fear of extinction, our preoccupation with survival and legacy, our tendency to see threats even where none exist, might all be echoes of a time when extinction was a daily possibility. The human tendency to form in-groups and out-groups, to be suspicious of strangers while being remarkably cooperative with those we consider us, might reflect the social dynamics of a tiny population where group cohesion was essential, but encounters with strangers were rare and potentially dangerous. Our psychological architecture was shaped by the bottleneck in ways we're only beginning to understand. The bottleneck might also explain some puzzling aspects of human fertility and reproduction. Humans have remarkably low fertility compared to our great ape relatives, with women typically able to conceive only during a brief window each month, and experiencing menopause that ends reproduction well before the end of life. These characteristics make little sense from a simple, evolutionary perspective that prioritizes maximum reproduction. But in the context of the bottleneck, where resources were scarce and every child required significant investment to survive, having fewer, more widely spaced children might have been advantageous. Menopause might have evolved to allow older women to help raise grandchildren rather than continuing to have their own children, a strategy that would be particularly valuable in a small population where experienced individuals were precious resources. The human propensity for storytelling and mythology might also trace back to the bottleneck. In a small population without writing, oral tradition would have been the only way to preserve and transmit crucial survival information across generations. The ability to encode information in memorable stories, to create narratives that could be accurately transmitted even as they entertained, would have been invaluable. Every human culture has mythology, stories about origins and endings, heroes and catastrophes. This universal human trait might have its roots in the bottleneck, when stories weren't just entertainment, but libraries of survival information encoded in narrative form. Our relationship with the environment might also bear the stamp of the bottleneck. Humans have a complex, often contradictory relationship with nature, simultaneously part of it and separate from it, dependent on it, and seeking to control it. This might reflect the experience of the bottleneck, when humans were at the mercy of environmental forces beyond their control, but survived through their ability to find and exploit refugia. The human drive to modify our environment, to create artificial refugia in the form of shelters, settlements, and eventually cities, might be an echo of the bottleneck experience, a deep drive to never again be completely at the mercy of environmental change. The bottleneck might even have influenced human spirituality and religion. The experience of near extinction, of being reduced to a tiny remnant in a vast, seemingly hostile world, might have fostered the development of religious or spiritual thinking as a way to make sense of existence and maintain hope in the face of despair. The nearly universal human tendency to seek meaning and purpose, to believe in something greater than ourselves, might be a psychological adaptation that helped our ancestors maintain the will to survive when rational calculation would have suggested giving up. The bottleneck might have been where humans first asked the big questions. Why are we here? What is our purpose? What forces control our fate? Modern human diseases might also carry the signature of the bottleneck. The small population size would have meant that many pathogens couldn't sustain themselves and would have gone extinct. The disease environment of the bottleneck would have been very different from what earlier, larger human populations experienced. When populations began to expand again, they would have been vulnerable to new diseases, but they also would have lost immunity to diseases that had disappeared during the bottleneck. The complex relationship between humans and infectious diseases, our vulnerability to certain pathogens and resistance to others, was shaped in part by the disease ecology of the bottleneck period. The bottleneck's influence on human genetics has implications for modern medicine. The reduced genetic diversity means that genetic diseases that might be rare in a more diverse species are relatively common in humans. But it also means that medical treatments developed for one human population are more likely to work for all humans than would be the case in a more genetically diverse species. The fact that humans are genetically quite similar means that we can have universal medicines, blood transfusions between strangers, and organ transplants between unrelated individuals. In a strange way, modern medicine benefits from our ancient brush with extinction. As we look at modern human populations, we can see echoes of the bottleneck in patterns of genetic variation. African populations have more genetic diversity than non-African populations, consistent with Africa being where the bottleneck population survived and where humans have lived continuously for the longest time. The reduced diversity in non-African populations reflects subsequent founder effects as small groups left Africa and colonized the rest of the world. Every human migration, from the first ventures out of Africa to the colonization of remote Pacific islands, has been a kind of echo of the original bottleneck, with small founding populations creating new evolutionary experiments. The bottleneck also left us with what some scientists call genomic deserts, regions of our DNA with unusually low variation. These regions might mark places where strong natural selection during or after the bottleneck fixed certain genetic variants in the entire population. By studying these regions, scientists can identify genes that were crucial for surviving the bottleneck or adapting to post-bottleneck conditions. These genes might be involved in brain development, immune function, metabolism, or other traits that were under strong selection during humanity's near extinction. The legacy of the bottleneck extends to the very structure of human society. The ability of humans to form large, complex societies with elaborate divisions of labor, hierarchies, and institutions might seem to contradict our evolution in small bands. But perhaps the bottleneck selected for a flexibility that allows us to function in groups of various sizes. We can still form the intense personal relationships that would have characterized the bottleneck population, but we can also cooperate with strangers in ways that would have been unnecessary when everyone knew everyone. This social flexibility might be one of the bottleneck's greatest gifts, allowing humans to scale from family groups to global civilizations. The bottleneck might also have influenced human attitudes toward risk and innovation. In a stable, large population, conservative strategies that stick with proven approaches might be favoured. But in the unstable, marginal environment of the bottleneck, innovation might have been essential. The human combination of risk aversion in some contexts and risk-seeking in others, our ability to be both conservative and innovative, might reflect the complex selective pressures of the bottleneck period. We are cautious because our ancestors who were reckless didn't survive, but we are also innovative because our ancestors who couldn't adapt to change didn't survive either. Looking at the modern world, we can see the bottleneck's influence everywhere. The fact that all humans can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, that we all share the same basic biology and psychology, that we can all learn any human language if exposed to it in childhood, all of this reflects our descent from a small, genetically homogeneous population. The bottleneck made us one species in a way that's unusual in the natural world. Despite our surface differences, we're all variations on a theme established by those 1,300 survivors. The story of the bottleneck also offers us perspective on current challenges. Modern humans worry about population decline, about birth rates falling below replacement in developed countries. But the bottleneck reminds us that humanity has survived and thrived from a much smaller population base. We worry about genetic diversity in endangered species, and rightly so, but humans are proof that a species can recover from extreme genetic bottleneck and still be successful. We worry about climate change and environmental catastrophe, serious concerns indeed, but the bottleneck shows us that humans have survived comparable or worse challenges with far less knowledge and technology than we have today. But the bottleneck also offers warnings. It shows us how close we came to extinction, how vulnerable even successful species can be to environmental change. It reminds us that our existence is not guaranteed, that we are here through a combination of luck, resilience, and adaptation that might not always be sufficient. The same low genetic diversity that unites us also makes us vulnerable to new diseases. The same social cooperation that allowed us to survive the bottleneck can break down under stress, leading to conflict that could be catastrophic given modern weapons. The bottleneck is both a source of hope, showing what humans can survive, and a warning about what we might face again. As we near the end of our journey through this ancient story, it's worth reflecting on what the bottleneck means for understanding ourselves. We are not the product of smooth, gradual evolution, but of a catastrophic event that nearly ended our lineage. We are not optimally designed, but carry the scars and compromises of near extinction. We are not inevitable, but contingent, the unlikely descendants of a tiny group of survivors. Understanding the bottleneck helps us understand why humans are the way we are, why we're so similar genetically despite our apparent diversity, why we're so social and cooperative, why we're so adaptable and innovative, why we carry certain genetic burdens and possess certain gifts. The bottleneck also connects us to each other in a profound way. Every human being, regardless of race, ethnicity, nationality, or any other division, is descended from the same small group of survivors. We are all cousins, all family, all bearers of the same ancient legacy. The differences between us, real and important as they might be in our daily lives, are trivial compared to what unites us. The bottleneck made us one human family in a literal genetic sense. When we look at another person, we're looking at someone who shares 99.9% of our DNA, someone whose ancestors survived the same near extinction, someone who carries the same genetic and cultural legacy of the bottleneck. The scientific study of the bottleneck continues to evolve. New techniques for analyzing ancient DNA are providing more detailed pictures of population sizes and relationships. Improved climate models are helping us understand the environmental conditions that might have caused the bottleneck. Archaeological discoveries are slowly filling in the gaps in our knowledge of where and how our ancestors lived during this period. Each new piece of evidence adds detail to the story, though many mysteries remain. We still don't know exactly where the refugia were, exactly what caused the population crash, exactly how our ancestors survived. These questions drive continued research, ensuring that our understanding of the bottleneck will continue to evolve. But even with all the uncertainties, the basic story is clear and profound. 900,000 years ago, our ancestors nearly went extinct. They survived in small refugia, probably in Africa, where they underwent a transformation that made them the ancestors of all later humans. The bottleneck left us with reduced genetic diversity, but also with enhanced cooperation, adaptability, and social intelligence. We carry the scars and gift of this near extinction in our genes, our behavior, and our cultures. We are who we are because of what happened during those desperate millennia when humanity hung by the thinnest of threads. As you drift towards sleep, listening to this ancient story, you might wonder what it would have been like to be one of those survivors. Imagine living in a world where everyone you could ever meet was someone you knew, where the entire human population could gather in a single valley. Imagine the weight of survival, knowing that every death diminished not just a family but the species itself. Imagine the joy of every birth, every child who survived to adulthood, every small increase in population that meant humanity might continue for another generation. Imagine not knowing that you were living through the most important period in human history, that your survival would determine whether millions of years of evolution would continue or end. Those ancient survivors couldn't have imagined us, their descendants nearly 1 million years later, 8 billion strong, spread across the entire planet, and even venturing beyond it. They couldn't have imagined cities and civilizations, art and science, the vast elaboration of human culture and technology that would eventually emerge from their simple struggle to survive. They couldn't have known that their perseverance through unimaginable hardship would eventually lead to beings who could look back across deep time and understand what they had endured. They survived not for glory or recognition, which they could never receive, but simply because life demands to continue, because giving up was not in their nature. And now, as we prepare to conclude this journey through deep time, to return from the ancient world to our present moment, we carry with us a new understanding of who we are and where we came from. We are not separate from the story of the bottleneck, but part of it, the latest chapter in a tale that began with those 1,300 survivors. Every human achievement, from the first cave painting to the symphonies of Beethoven, from the invention of agriculture to the landing on the moon, was made possible by their survival. Every human life, including your own, is a continuation of the chain they refuse to let break. The bottleneck is not just a scientific fact, but a profound story about the nature of existence, about resilience in the face of overwhelming odds, about the power of life to persist, even when persistence seems impossible. It's a story that puts our own challenges in perspective, reminding us that humans have survived worse, and that we carry within us the genetic and cultural tools that allowed our ancestors to survive near extinction. It's a story that unites us, reminding us that despite all our differences, we are one family, descended from the same small group of survivors, carrying the same ancient legacy forward into an uncertain but hopeful future.